The new technologies of helical and multi-detector CT scanning mean that we now get volumetric data sets with CT. That means we can slice and dice the imaging data set in any plane we want and get the same resolution. We can also generate beautiful 3D images, such as CT angiographic images, with CT. And this is just an example of a volume rendered image from a CT data set that shows cryoablation of a left adrenal mass in a patient with metastatic lung cancer. Notice we can see the bones very well, the lungs, the vessels in the lungs, and the liver. It's a great 3D depiction. And another example of a patient that has a different type of pancreatic tumor, intraductal papillary mucinous neoplasm. The anatomy is so detailed, we can see that there's massive dilatation of the main pancreatic duct, side branch duct, so we know that this is a malignant mixed side branch and main duct IPMN. And notice how well the vessels enhance and are distinguished from surrounding fat. We have a pretty good evaluation of liver, kidneys, adrenals, and spleen. So the disadvantages of CT, one of the main things we think about nowadays is radiation dose. And although the risks of radiation from CT scanning are not fully understood, there is evidence that CT scanning can cause late cancers 10 years or more later in patients. So this has resulted in us modifying our protocol so that we do less multiphasic scanning. We try not to repeat scans unnecessarily, and we are less inclined to use CT in young patients or patients with curable diseases who have a long life expectancy. I wanted to mention IV contrast-induced nephropathy because throughout my career, that's always been a concern with contrast-enhanced CT, and we still take a very cautious approach with IV contrast in patients who have renal insufficiency or risk factors. But I wanted to bring to your attention that there are studies beginning to come out that are looking at this more critically, and what they're finding is if you look at very similar populations of inpatients, for example, and look at the incidence of acute renal insufficiency developing in patients who either underwent contrast-enhanced CT or did not receive contrast, the incidence of acute renal injury is actually almost identical. And so there's uncertainty about the existence of contrast-induced nephropathy, or at least the incidence of contrast-induced nephropathy. So I just wanted you to be aware of that. We still occasionally have patients with IV contrast allergy. That's another fascinating topic that we can't go into in detail, but it may cause us to have to do steroid preps or not use IV contrast. Another disadvantage of CT, of course, is that unlike PET, we really get very little, if any, metabolic information from the study.